The thing is, even good NuWho makes me frustrated in its own way. This is a good episode, a great one even. But the main feeling I got once I finished this episode was, well, the feeling if they can do it in this instance, why the bloody hell can't they do it in the other instances? If NuWho is capable of telling a smart, tight, well-paced story with complete character arcs, why is it only like once a series and most of the time I have to sit there watching shallow, rushed, spectacle-driven nonsense, if I'm lucky? And if I'm not lucky, it's something like the 2 episodes that precede this one in the running order. It's just frustrating to see how a writer occasionally gets it. In this episode, there's no meaningless spectacle, no stupid action sequences, no fucking catchphrases, and the quirky dialogue is kept to a minimum, all the characters behave reasonably, and it's well paced and not overstuffed. I mean, it's not flawless, we'll examine everything in more detail as we go along, obviously, it'd be a pretty short review otherwise, but overall it's deeply frustrating knowing that NuWho would in general be a lot stronger if this was the overall average instead of the rare exception. And well, it's a frustration that has doubled as we approach the 20th anniversary of the show's return, and knowing not only have them absolutely no lessons been learnt by anyone throughout those 2 decades, the examples of when it's done right are just sort of also placed aside, so we can instead have episodes where someone decides to name their child by pointing at a road sign when nobody else is fucking around. Hurrah for us. Anyway, gently placing Russell T Davies' latest exertions to the side, Mummy on the Orient Express is, as I said, a great episode. Not flawless, but great nevertheless. It's funny because in theory it's one of the stupid Moffat era think of a cool title first and all the fundamental parts of storytelling second episodes, which gave a shit like dinosaurs on a spaceship. But writer Jamie Mathieson takes the silly concepts and turns it into a mysterious and tense plot that gives plenty of opportunity for character exploration. While director Paul Wilmshurst creates a dynamic and energetic piece. Peter Capaldi arguably hits his stride in the role for the first time here, and even Jenna Coleman, playing a version of Clara I'd like to see suffer a nasty accident much less than usual, manages to imbue her performance with a great deal of subtlety. It's these solid elements that come together to create a successful piece that means I can mostly forgive its flaws, and that comes back to a philosophy I tend to hold. When the foundations of your story and production are solid, when you have an interesting plot, well-used characters, etc., I'm more willing to forgive the holes in the pieces if, as a whole, it succeeds. I'll still pick the plot holes because it's fun and makes for good review material, but I'll temper that with the acceptance that there are minor flaws in an overall successful piece, whereas in a shit episode they just further prove the writer didn't know what they were bloody doing. It's always nice to get the details right, but if the fundamentals are there, it's less important whether they are absolutely watertight. Covering this episode brings me to the halfway point of Series 8, which makes this by some distance the most covered series of the show I've done so far. Consider I haven't done a single episode from Series 6 yet, for instance. And that's different from the way I haven't covered anything post-Moffat era yet, which is the deliberate choice for various reasons. It's just that there's something about this series which has drawn my critical eye to it. I've mentioned before the Capaldi era was when I began to develop proper critical faculties, and while it wouldn't be till Series 10 they became a lot more honed, this series was really where it started for me. I'm therefore not only drawing on what I see in front of me now, but also how I felt about them at the time. The thing is, though, that's only really in theory this time around, because as a matter of fact I don't really remember how I felt about this episode at the time. The general idea, though, of how my critical faculties have evolved is part of the reason this series does interest me so much. I don't like most of it, and I didn't then, but the reasons have changed, and so has the analysis, and there is kind of a fascination about it despite that. Anyway, let's get started on the episode. As mentioned, the director was Paul Wilmshurst, who previously directed Kill the Moon. That wasn't his fault though, so no hard feelings, and his work here proves that he should share none of the blame for that particular disaster. His work in this episode is very strong for a few reasons. Firstly, given the limited nature of the sets, narrow train carriages, and pretty much the entire story, a lot was going to ride on how he puts his shots together, but he succeeds in keeping things both tight and tense, but not going over the top with either of them. Too often in NuWho does the director go overboard, but Wilmshurst avoids this and keeps things to a certain level of subtlety while maintaining the tense atmosphere, etc. He also succeeds in elevating areas where the script falters a little. When Professor History and the Doctor are expositing about the foretold, it feels a little like it's falling back on NuWho's old habits after it had been so promising with showing not telling and using mystery. But Wilmshurst elevates the scene by interspersing the exposition with the foretold attacking the cook. This not only gives something to break up the exposition and make it more interesting, but also heightens the sense of threat, adding a very real and obvious element to what would otherwise be standard NuWho talking with a bit of the quirkiness added in. Wilmshurst also does brilliantly with his portrayal of the foretold attacks. The transition between the shots with the mummy there and with it not there, for instance, are seamless and perfectly placed. He also milks that 66 seconds for all it's worth. Not a single moment is wasted and every attack feels weighty and meaningful as a result. Overall, he just does a fantastic job with the directing here, and proving if we gave him a script that wasn't better use of toilet paper, he could very much deliver, and, well, frankly, they owed it to him after making him do Kill the Moon. It's an absolutely fantastic job. Other elements of the production also impressed. This was clearly an episode where they knew how to use their budget. The limited train set is obviously all they needed, but it meant that they could spend on the effects, and they're quite impressive given everything. The set design itself is also fantastic, and the Foretold a brilliant bit of costume work. Like the directing, it manages to be threatening and creepy without going over the top. It's easy to see how it could have ended up looking like a parody of an old movie mummy, but it avoids that. Also, Murray Gold does really well here. His music is tense and atmospheric, but also has a lot of power, which was what was called for. It shows how he could be very good when he was in his wheelhouse, and the issue was always that when he was taken out of that wheelhouse. In fact, the only issue is that, like that old NuWho chestnut, it's frequently mixed too loud, but that's a small issue overall. His music is the final piece of an excellent puzzle that brings his production together. Now, when it comes to the script, I will mostly have positive things to say, but there are a few drawbacks I do want to focus on first, just to get it out of the way. I don't want the review of an episode I mostly think is great to be bogged down in negative stuff, so let's just get it out of the way. Firstly, as I mentioned, it does sometimes fall back into NuWho's old habits, which is a shame given how effective most of it is. The Doctor talking to himself in his cabin is part of the let's do the stuff that didn't work in the Matt Smith era and make it work even less now with Capaldi's spiel that's everywhere in this series in particular. The mystery shopper joke just doesn't work for me, given how quickly the Captain changes his mind about the Doctor anyway. It feels like it would have just smoothed things over for him to have been presented as an authority figure anyway, because, well, as long as if we get comedy value from he is a mystery shopper, the joke is he's a mystery shopper, and that's about it. Also, the Captain changes his mind about the Doctor extremely quickly, as I said. He basically goes from throw him out into space to, oh, he's basically in charge now, in about 15 seconds. Yes, I know he just watched someone be killed by the Foretold, but it was not as if there hadn't been other deaths to weaken his resolve or anything. This is, I think, the result of everyone's favourite topic of discussion. Yes, it's time for the NuWho episode format once again. Overall, the way this episode uses its 45 minutes is effective, and that will go in the positives bit, but there are occasionally bits that betray the difficulty of effectively pacing an episode of Who for that length, such as the fact that the Captain immediately changes allegiance because we need to go from the basically the sceptical of the Doctor to basically the supporter of the Doctor bit of the base under siege archetype pretty pronto. It's only a few moments, but I think a lack of time also leads to another of the issues I have, which is I think it would have really elevated this to have had a proper villain. Gus the Train AI is our villain for the evening, but he is woefully underdeveloped. He's a bit of a prickish AI. I mean, that's a bit of a light way to describe a murdering AI, but we'll go with it. He's a prickish AI, and that's about it to him. And it's frustrating because the idea of some hostile actor wanting to use the Foretold as a weapon is an interesting, if admittedly cliched idea. But we never get any deeper idea of what this hostile actor is and why they want it. Gus just wants it because he's evils, and doesn't even seem particularly bothered that the Doctor eventually finds out that it's not really all that much use as a weapon. This is where the lack of time bit comes in, because it's clear that the reason is because, well, there isn't really any time to develop Gus any further. The result is, though, he just feels like a weak villain, a motivationless voice and nothing else. While the cold detachment does have a creepiness factor, this is undermined by how little depth there really is, which should be plain to see for all his interactions. What's more is that while this feels like it should maybe be a tease for some reveal later on of who's actually behind it, this is never followed up on, which makes it seem all the more bizarre. Finally, there is the undeniable issue that I personally have that, well, in case I haven't made it pretty clear, I cannot stand Clara Oswald and find her behaviour in this series usually pretty objectionable. While she is much better written in this episode than she usually is, and the character arc she and the Doctor have is both on paper and on the screen an effective one for this episode, I have to admit I find it difficult to get over how much I dislike this arc's overall use within Series 8. The idea of the Doctor and the companion having reached a difference they cannot reconcile and therefore ready to call it quits, and exploring that idea and how it might affect them, it is a really good one, and in the vacuum, just considering this episode, it's executed really well, but I just can't get over the fact this leads in from Kill the Moon, where both of them acted so utterly reprehensible, it just means it's difficult to really feel any sympathy for either of them. All I can think about is I remember Kill the Moon, and therefore come to the conclusion she's right that he's an uncaring prick, and he's right that she's a self-centered overbearing arsehole. I shouldn't be thinking this, but there we are. It's all the worse because it's not this episode's fault, and as it's written, produced and performed, it's actually really good within it, but sometimes you have to take an episode within the context of its overall series, and this feels like a weakness as a result. Want to know the worst thing about this episode, though? I'll bloody tell you what, that awful Queen cover at the start. The number of people who ask for a slow cover of Don't Stop Me Now is precisely 0. Freddie Mercury, that lady is not. Bad episode, bad. Think about what you did. That's it for the bad stuff, though, and I'll be fair by starting the good stuff by discussing the character arc I was just talking about and how it does work. As I said, the idea of exploring our Doctor-companion relationship might be so fractured is a good one, and in the context of the episode itself is explored well. Much is left unsaid, which avoids unnecessary and clunky exposition, and instead focuses on their actions and a dialogue that results. We understand Clara's frustration at the Doctor's methods, and this develops naturally throughout the episode as the situation worsens, and how little the Doctor has really taken on board Clara's criticisms becomes apparent. Yet we also understand how the Doctor always has to do his thing, and Clara's expectations otherwise are not realistic, and deep down she knows that. We also get the sense throughout that her heart is not really in the giving it up plan that makes her change her mind at the end seem both natural and unforced, but also not overly telegraphed. We also allow for this brief episode to be given the impression that Clara is in fact not always right and always to be obeyed. Her unsureness of whether she wants to stay with the Doctor or not leads her to be conflicted and to make assumptions she maybe shouldn't. And this strikes a very effective balance. She's obviously intelligent enough to keep up with the situation, but nevertheless the Doctor has been one step ahead and this influences her decision making at the end of the episode. I like that there are many layers to this and this breathes more life into our characters. As I said, Jenna Coleman gives a better performance than usual here. She clearly relishes the chance to add some more subtleties to her performance rather than what we usually get with Clara. I'd say actually this is maybe my choice for her strongest performance. I'll have to watch some of the other ones again, but yeah, she definitely delivers here. This episode is one of the few occasions in which the 12th Doctor's Series 8 character actually works. I won't go as far as to say it feels like this is the only time they managed to get the original idea for what his character would be to work, because frankly, I'm not sure there ever was much of an idea for that beyond he's a bit of a prick. But this episode, probably for the only time in the series, adds some dimensions to the prickishness, and does add an interesting look to what could have been had they pursued this further, as in Series 9 they did a sort of a U-turn of a bit and soften out his harsher edges. Here the Doctor is single-minded in his goal to defeat Gus, and all other considerations take a back seat, or at least that's what we're made to think. We see throughout the episode how this is both a positive and a negative, and that it does allow them to briskly make progress throughout the mystery and get to a position where he can overcome the foretold and save as many people as possible from Gus. But on the other hand, he throws lives away at random and is callous in a way that no other Doctor really would be. Unlike in Kill the Moon, though, where it felt artificial for him to act so callously, and, well, because he was just being a complete arsehole, here he's doing it simply because he sees no value in compassion that he cannot fulfill through any other means other than the ultimate compassion in saving as many people as he can. And yet, at the end, when he explains his rationale to Clara, it adds a layer to it, that without her really clocking on, reading between the lines we do hear that every time someone died it gnawed away at him, but he had no choice but to keep going, and we look back at how easily he nearly sacrificed himself to save Maisie, and we do understand it. It takes this arsehole who seemingly didn't care about bodies dropping around him all series, and adds a dimension to it, that this simply is the game he's decided to play, but as all the Doctors play it differently, this is the way the 12th Doctor's doing it. For instance, the 1st and 6th Doctors would be outraged and would use the outrage to add in their outbursts. The 2nd would pretend to be overwhelmed by it while secretly working on his plan. The 4th and 11th Doctors would allow their comic veneers to briefly drop and the hidden danger to reveal itself, just for a moment. The 12th plays the game straight though. He's focused on winning, and will worry about the cost to his soul later. In what seems like an extension of the uncaring prick we seen earlier, there is in fact so much depth that Mathieson has added to it here. Peter Capaldi of course plays it beautifully, and as I said earlier, this feels like the point at which he gets into his stride into the role. Here he grabs onto the deep characterization we're given and really runs with it. He performs the role with a confidence that does little to show what vulnerability lies beneath. This is the 12th Doctor making sure at no point does he let any cracks in the surface show, and Capaldi does a fantastic job of maintaining that, while also letting us know through the subtleties of what is really going on. Capaldi is obviously an absolutely phenomenal actor, and here he is in his absolute element. So the stuff with our regulars is great, as long as you forget what they were doing the week before, but what about with the guest characters? Well, this is another strength of the episode, in that it manages to add so much depth to the guest characters, with actually very little time to work with, showing out how easy it should be to make your characters more than just cardboard cutouts and archetypes. Admittedly, this episode has some excellent performers that make the job easier. Frank Skinner gives a brilliantly upbeat performance as Perkins, having that everyman quality while also showing the intelligence beneath the surface, while David Bamber gives the Captain enormous depth to his backstory from just a few lines. He really shows the regrets of a broken man from just his delivery. But ultimately, what's on the page is what drives this to success. Perkins comes across as likeable and intelligent because he's written to be useful and smart, and really fits as a comparison to Clara. He has many of her qualities, but not enough to really replace her, for instance. The Captain is shown to be a broken, regretful man, as I said, which makes all his actions understandable and his sacrifice truly heroic. He really is the only one of the people killed by the Foretold who dies bravely, and that shows how his small arc really is effective. Maisie also comes across as broken by her regrets and bitterness, but unlike the Captain where its point is redemption, here it's to spark sympathy, to show it's the actions of others that have led her here. Hell, even the Foretold feels like more of a character than you usually get. The way the Doctor explains everything about it in 66 seconds is just fantastically written, perfectly paced in delivery, and its final salute feels like a great cap to it. The plot is also brilliant. First of all, it's perfectly paced. It's just got just enough to fill out the 45 minutes without needing padding, but not enough to feel rushed, with a few exceptions as I mentioned earlier. It opens with that brilliant teaser that introduces a real feeling of tension and mystery, and the plot progresses perfectly with those elements in mind. I always say the best plots are the ones that answer its initial questions before too long, but ask new ones as you go along, and this is a perfect example of that. For instance, we get answers fairly early on why there is a mummy here, part of the legend and all that, but then exactly what it is and how it works comes much later on. Overall, the pacing is absolutely brilliant. It doesn't feel rushed, because, it's not, it fits perfectly within the 45-minute time frame, but it also doesn't feel too slow either. It goes at a steady pace throughout. It works really, really well in terms of the pacing. As for the plot itself, it is structured really well, and we find out most of what we find out through natural dialogue and interactions and stuff like that. While there's a bit of technobabble conveniences and clunky exposition, just to remind us all it's NuWho, it is forgivable for two reasons. Firstly, as I said at the start, you can forgive some small things when the overall result is a positive one like this. And secondly, as technobabble and clunky exposition goes, it's usually short to the point and makes sense on the surface level, which is what matters. As I alluded to early on, it's actually more or less a Trout and Nearer Base Under Siege plot updated for the modern day, but it's done in a dynamic and unique style. You wouldn't confuse it for any actual Base Under Siege story. What it does do right, though, is that sort of creeping dread that the Base Under Siege did really well, the idea that the threat is getting closer and closer to overcoming us. It is effective. Another major strength of the story related to that is how tense and how creepy it can be. This is part of how well structured the mystery is, but the mummy does really feel like an unnerving presence. The audience has no idea what this thing really is until very late on, and even then its foreboding approach as the Doctor desperately tries to work out its nature is absolutely brilliant. In fact, maybe the most effective moment for this is the teaser, with Maisie's grandmother panicking about it, and we have absolutely no idea what's going on. Is this even in her mind? Is it even real? But yeah, the mystery works really effectively to make it really creepy. Mathieson does hit a perfect balance overall, making sure that we're impressed with the plot, but also creeped out by his monster. There are a few gaps in the story. For instance, if a lot of the crew were holograms, why weren't all of them? Was there any real need for most of those pauses and stuff? And for the fact that the Doctor really kind of knew what was going on the whole time, his scene in the cabin where he was sort of doing all that quirky, ooh, am I really going to investigate this stuff, feels a bit unnecessary. If he knew what was going on, why would he do that? So yeah, there are a few plot holes, but as I said, I'm happy to wave them off as the overall result is so effective. What really helps, though, is that the dialogue is well above Moffat era standards. It has its duff, a few jokes here and there that don't land, a few quirky bits that nobody ever realised were just embarrassing, and some of the more awkward moments caused by the time constraints. It's not perfect at all, but it feels far more natural than usual for this era. The quirky, unnatural bits and the shit jokes are mercifully mostly absent, and we get a real sense these are real people really talking. The bits when the Foretold is advancing, for instance, the Professor's desperate attempts to bargain his way out, the Captain's bravery in the face of death, and the Doctor's gamble to defeat it, all absolutely have both the naturalness and the urgency they need in the situation. The frank honesty of the Doctor's discussion with Clara on the planet at the end of the episode also works really well in this regard. It's night and day compared to the overtop shit from Kill the Moon. It sounds like the frank confession of someone who's just been through the ringer, and well, that's because that's what it is. So, I started this review by posing that this episode was in a way quite frustrating, despite being very good. And if you aren't sure what I meant by that point, I'll explain that I basically spent the last 20 minutes or so praising the episode for having effective characters, a smart, well-executed plot, and sharp dialogues. And I'm just thinking, shouldn't that always be the case? It feels like a tad like I'm praising the episode for getting the bare basics right, when most of NuWho can't even manage that. And that's what I mean by frustrating. I want this to be NuWho's average, so people watch every episode and think the same things I do here. But I suppose that does feel a bit like I'm selling the episode short, which I'm definitely not doing. It's a very strong outing, easily the best of its series and one of the very best of its era. The plot is smart and complex but not overcomplicated, the characters are very strong, and the basis surrounding a unique look at the Doctor-companion relationship is a very effective one. It's creepy, mysterious, tense, fantastically directed and edited, and I think in the end comes as much more than the sum of its parts. The elements all come together to make a thoroughly effective 45 minutes. But I just can't shake the feeling they should be doing this a bit more often, instead of, well, no, take your pick from the last 20 years. It won't be difficult to find a massive disaster which I will compare negatively against this episode. Final score for Mummy on the Orient Express is 8 out of 10. If Gus had been a bit stronger of a villain, I think it would have made that 9. But I think that is the one glaring weakness of the episode. But other than that, this is definitely a triumph. It's smart, inventive, tense, creepy, and all plus more of the above. Mathieson also wrote the following episode, Flatline, which I'll admit I don't think I've seen since original broadcast, and I remember finding it decisively average then, but I think perhaps it might be worth a re-evaluation based on this. He also wrote one of the Maisie Williams episodes, but co-wrote it with Moffat, so that's easy to pin elsewhere, and Oxygen, so maybe subtlety isn't his greatest strength, but whatever that, even if this episode is just him in his element, I'll take it, because it's a fantastic script, and it's produced into an absolutely fantastic episode. Sometimes all you need to make me be positive is to get the bare necessities right, eh?